The night was suffocatingly still. Not a single sound broke the eerie silence that hung thick in the air. Samantha Brooks sat in her living room, staring out the window at the dark street beyond, her mind lost in thought. The dim glow from the lamp on the coffee table flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the walls. It should have been a quiet, peaceful evening, but tonight was different. Something felt off. She couldn't quite place it, but there was a nagging feeling in her gut that she couldn't shake. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, its screen lighting up in the dim room. It was a strange, unexpected notification, an emergency alert. Her heart skipped a beat as she unlocked the phone, thinking it was a test or a random message. But when she read it, her stomach dropped. The message was short, yet it sent a chill down her spine. Don't let them in. They're coming. A cold wave of unease spread over her, her fingers gripping the phone tightly. The message felt wrong, too cryptic, too urgent. It wasn't like any alert she had ever received before. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. A technical glitch? A prank? She shook her head, dismissing it as some random mistake. Still, the words echoed in her mind, refusing to leave. They're coming. She turned away from the phone, trying to push the thought from her mind, but the unease gnawed at her. Samantha tried to focus on something else, reaching for her tea, but her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was even more distorted, almost as if the words were trying to break free from the screen. Don't let them in. They're coming. You're next. She froze, the cup in her hand shaking slightly. It was the same alert, but the urgency was palpable now. The words almost seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Her mind raced. She had to ignore it. It had to be a glitch, a sick joke. But something deep inside her knew it wasn't. Something about it felt too real, too deliberate. The longer she stared at the screen, the more uncomfortable she became. The room around her seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in like a heavy weight. She looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching her. She decided to call her best friend, Kayla Foster. Maybe Kayla would have some logical explanation for all of this. But as the phone rang, there was an odd, crackling sound on the line. The call dropped, leaving Samantha staring at the dead screen in disbelief. It was as if someone had cut the line deliberately. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a glitch. This was something else. Something much worse. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the quiet house, each one more forceful than the last. Samantha's heart leaped into her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Not at this hour. She stood up, her breath quickening. Cautiously, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Only the dark, empty porch. She opened the door, half expecting to find some prankster standing on the other side, but the porch was empty, the night air chilling her skin. Her pulse raced as she closed the door quickly, bolting it shut. She glanced out the window again, her mind whirling. What was happening? Then she heard it again. Footsteps. Faint at first, then louder, each step dragging slowly, deliberately. It was coming from the backyard, just outside the window. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkened room. Nothing. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She hurried to check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, or so it seemed. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger with each passing second. She couldn't explain it, but every instinct in her screamed that something was wrong. She glanced down at her phone again. The same alert message, flashing on the screen. Samantha, don't trust anyone. Her skin prickled with cold. How did it know her name? She stared at the words, her fingers trembling. She tried to call the police, but her phone went black. It died, just like that, with no warning. And then she heard it, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper, as if it was coming from the very air around her. You're not safe? They're already here. Samantha spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. But no one was there. There was no sound, no movement, just the cold, oppressive silence. She backed away, her breath shallow, her body frozen with fear. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and move. For a split second, she thought she saw something, a figure, darting past the window. Her pulse quickened. They were here. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped even further. It felt like the world outside had stopped, like everything had gone quiet just for her. The sense of being trapped in her own home was suffocating. And then she saw it. A shadow, moving outside the window. It wasn't like any shadow she had seen before. It was different. Longer. Taller. And it didn't just fade away. It lingered, watching her. Samantha's hands were shaking now, her mind racing. She couldn't move. Her legs wouldn't obey her. The room felt too small, too closed in. And then she heard it again. The voice. It wasn't words anymore, but a sensation. Something was trying to reach her. Something wasn't human. A sudden, sharp knock echoed through the house. The door. She rushed to it, terrified, but when she reached the door and peered out into the night, there was nothing. The street was still empty, not a soul in sight. She closed the door, her thoughts a blur of panic. But then she heard it again. The footsteps. Only this time, they weren't outside. They were inside, coming closer. Samantha's heart raced, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling of being suffocated by the house, as if the walls were closing in on her with every breath she took. She couldn't understand what was happening. It was as if the world had suddenly transformed into something twisted, something that didn't make sense. She turned to the phone, trying to calm herself with the thought of reaching out for help. But when she tried calling Mrs. Wallace, the older woman who lived next door, the line went dead, an eerie silence taking over. Desperation twisted in her stomach as she dialed Mr. Henson's number, but the call dropped before it even had a chance to ring. Was it just coincidence? Or was there something worse at play? Frustrated and scared, she grabbed her coat and rushed out the front door, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain this madness. But the street, once familiar and comforting, was no longer the peaceful suburban road she knew. The night air felt thick, like it was pressing against her chest, the trees standing like dark, looming figures, their branches reaching toward her as if they were alive. She paused in the middle of the driveway, staring at the empty street ahead. The silence was deafening. No cars, no people. The world outside felt wrong, almost unreal, like she had stepped into another dimension. The houses around her, once so warm and inviting, now seemed like hollow shells, their windows dark and empty. Was it her mind playing tricks, or had everything truly shifted into something otherworldly? She looked around again, the creeping sensation of being watched growing stronger by the second. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the sidewalk. She tried to call for help again, but this time, her voice seemed to vanish as soon as it left her mouth. It felt like she was screaming into a void. No one would hear her. No one was coming. The unsettling thought hung in the air like a dark cloud, smothering her hope. Desperate, she turned back to the house. Her steps hurried as the door slammed behind her, its sound too loud in the oppressive silence. Inside, the air was colder now, almost icy. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to warm up, but it didn't help. The shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, slithering like living things, twisting and changing shape. Every time she looked away, and then back, they were different. She couldn't trust her eyes anymore. The walls weren't just walls. They were moving, shifting, as if they were breathing along with her. Every inch of the house felt alive, waiting for something to happen. Something bad. Samantha stepped back, her breath coming faster, panic building in her chest. She wanted to escape, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The windows were shut. She was trapped. And the shadows were everywhere. They seemed to reach out from the corners of the room, creeping in, filling the space with a cold that sent shivers down her spine. She rushed to the window again, hoping to see the familiar world outside, hoping for a glimpse of normalcy. But as she peered out, she saw nothing but darkness. No streetlights, no sounds, just the void stretching endlessly into the night. Then she heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, almost like the wind, but the words were unmistakable. "You're not safe. They're already here." Her heart skipped a beat. Who was saying that? The voice wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone she recognized. But it felt real, so real that it sent an icy chill down her spine. It was as though it was inside her head, burrowing into her thoughts, twisting them. The voice urged her to doubt everything, to doubt the house, to doubt herself. You can't trust anyone, not anymore. No one is who they seem. A sharp pang of terror ripped through her. Was this real? Was she losing her mind? Her reflection in the window distorted for a split second, and she jerked her head back. There, just behind her, the reflection in the mirror caught her eye. Samantha froze. Her own face stared back at her, but something was wrong. Something about the way the reflection moved. It didn't match her own movements. It smiled, but the smile wasn't hers. It was a cruel, mocking grin that sent waves of nausea through her body. The reflection's eyes glinted with malice, as if it was enjoying her panic. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like ice. "You're already part of this." Samantha stumbled backward, her chest tightening. She blinked, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The reflection was still there, but it wasn't her. It was a twisted version of her, eyes empty and cold, the smile widening as if it was something that had been waiting for her. "You can't escape. You're already part of this." The words repeated over and over, each time colder than the last. Samantha's head spun as the room seemed to close in on her. Her reflection laughed, a low, echoing sound that didn't belong to her. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the voice, but it wouldn't stop. The reflection was still there, still smiling, still speaking, each word heavier than the last. Samantha couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. The walls, the shadows, the voice, the reflection, it was all becoming too much. It was as if everything she had ever known was slipping away, replaced by a world that didn't make sense, a world that was turning against her. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, when she looked down, the screen was cracked, the message that had once seemed so innocuous now warped and terrifying. "Don't trust anyone, not even yourself." The words flashed, distorted, like they were flickering in and out of existence, as if the world itself was being erased and rewritten. Samantha looked up at the dark room around her, the shadows pressing in tighter. She knew something was coming. Something she couldn't escape. The knock at the door came again, softer this time, as if whatever was on the other side was waiting, watching. And then the footsteps started again, inside the house, coming closer. Samantha was no longer sure what was real. The reflection, the whispers, the shadows, they had taken on a life of their own, and she was trapped in their twisted game. She was no longer alone, and whatever had been outside, whatever had been knocking on the door, was no longer the biggest threat. The true terror was inside the house with her, and it was closing in. Samantha's heart raced, her breath shallow and quick as her eyes darted around the room. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. The whispers hadn't stopped. They surrounded her, suffocating her with each passing moment. Her head spun, the weight of everything bearing down on her, pushing her to the edge. The house felt like a trap, and she could no longer tell if it was the house itself that was changing, or if it was her mind slipping away into madness. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and strange noises seemed to come from all directions. Scratching, scraping, faint screams, muffled cries that seemed to echo from far away. Every sound made her jump. Every whisper made her skin crawl. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't even breathe properly. It was as though the very air had become poisonous, every corner of her home now a suffocating prison. The silence that used to offer comfort now felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to break. Samantha rushed to the windows again, her eyes scanning the yard, looking for any sign of what was outside. The figures, those distorted, twisted shapes, hadn't left. Every time she looked through the glass, she saw movement, shadows shifting just beyond her sight. Figures that didn't belong, crouching in her yard, their limbs wrong, their bodies distorted and unnatural. They were barely visible, hidden in the dark, but she could feel their presence, a constant pressure on her chest, like they were waiting for her to open the door, waiting for her to let them in. She turned, trembling, grabbing her phone. Maybe she could call someone, anyone. But when she answered, there was only static, the voices distorted, like they were coming from another world. The words she could make out didn't make sense, screams mixed with hissing, unintelligible words in a language she couldn't understand. The calls came one after another, always the same, always warped and filled with a dark, crawling presence. Each call made her feel smaller, more isolated. She could almost feel the figures following her, always just behind her, watching her every move, their eyes never leaving her. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming. She couldn't tell if she was imagining things. Maybe it was all in her mind, maybe the stress was breaking her, but the more she saw, the more she couldn't ignore it. The figures, were they real? Were they just shadows of her imagination? Or were they something worse? something far more sinister than she could comprehend. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, every step she took being observed by eyes that weren't human, eyes that didn't belong. The voice in her head grew louder, more insistent, its tone taunting now, as though it enjoyed watching her unravel. "They're getting closer, Samantha. You can't stop them. They're already inside." The words slithered into her mind, making her skin prickle. The voice had grown darker, angrier, with every passing moment, its anger almost palpable. It spoke in a language she didn't understand, but she could feel the malice in each word, like they were meant to break her, to twist her thoughts into something she couldn't control. Samantha spun around, her eyes wide with panic, her breath coming in short gasps. She heard it again, the footsteps, inside the house. The sound was unmistakable, slow, methodical, coming closer. She turned toward the sound, her pulse pounding in her ears, but when she looked, there was nothing there. The house was empty. She was alone, or so she thought. The figures had moved again. She could feel them in the corners of the rooms, lurking just out of sight, moving between shadows, their numbers growing with each passing second. They were getting closer, but they weren't visible, not yet. They were like smoke, just out of reach, their presence like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to see. She had to know. With a shaking hand, she reached for the door. The figures, whatever they were, had to be outside. Maybe, just maybe, if she confronted them, they would leave. They had to leave. She flung the door open with a force that felt like it was driven by sheer desperation. But the moment the door opened, a wave of dizziness slammed into her. Her vision blurred. The world tilted, spinning around her, and before she knew it, she crumpled to the ground. When she opened her eyes again, the world was no longer the same. The yard was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating darkness. She couldn't see anything, just shadows, stretching out in all directions. The air felt different too, colder, heavier. And the figures, they were there, all around her, closing in, their twisted forms moving like shadows in the dark. Their eyes gleamed with malice, their bodies stretching and contorting in ways that no human should be able to. They were everywhere, their distorted shapes crawling toward her, their limbs too long, too crooked, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. A sense of terror gripped her chest, and she scrambled to her feet, looking around, but it was impossible to make sense of the nightmare she was trapped in. The figures surrounded her, their cold, lifeless eyes fixed on her, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were savoring the moment. And then she saw it, the message. It was smeared in red, dripping like blood across her door. "We are already inside." Her heart stopped. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The words burned into her mind, searing her thoughts with a chilling truth she didn't want to face. The figures weren't just outside. They were inside her house now. They were already here. They had always been here, and now there was no escape. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the darkness. Samantha backed away, her breath ragged, her mind racing, but it was too late. The figures were closing in, their twisted forms moving faster now, their eyes hungry. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her, trapping her in a world that no longer made sense, a world where nothing was real and everything was out to get her. And then, with a final mocking laugh, the whisper returned, louder than before, filling her mind with its twisted words. "You can't escape. You never could." Samantha's mind was unraveling, each thought slipping further and further away. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room melting into shadows that seemed to move on their own. The figures were still there, their eyes never leaving her. But now they were silent. Too silent. Their twisted bodies pressed in around her, and every inch of the house felt like it was shrinking, closing her in. There was no escape, no way out. The walls seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, the darkness thickening, suffocating her. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the phone, the only thing that seemed real in the madness swirling around her. But the moment she touched it, the screen flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, the phone rang. The sound was sharp, cutting through the air, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the caller ID. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The name on the screen was one she hadn't seen in years, a name she thought she would never hear again, a name she had buried deep in her past. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was the stranger. The same voice she remembered, but distorted, like something had twisted it. It didn't sound like it used to. There was a rasp to it now, a darkness that hadn't been there before. The voice was colder, rougher, as though it had been through something unimaginable. "Samantha," the voice rasped, and her blood turned to ice. "You're not alone. The creatures are coming for you. They're already inside. They've been waiting." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. The stranger? But he was dead. She'd seen him die. She had witnessed it. How could he be here now, speaking to her like this? She wanted to hang up, to throw the phone away, but something in the voice held her captive. Something in it made her listen, made her freeze in place. "Do you hear them?" The stranger continued, his voice trembling with something between fear and warning. "They're whispering. They're inside your head. They're playing with you. They're waiting for you to break. But you have to listen, Samantha. You have to." But before he could finish, the line cut off. The phone went silent, and a cold chill settled over her. She stared at the screen, unsure whether the call had even been real. It felt wrong. It didn't feel like the stranger. It felt like something else, something pretending to be him. The air around her thickened, and she could hear it now. Whispers, soft and quiet at first, but growing louder. They weren't the stranger's voice. They were different. They were more like breathing, like the sound of something just out of sight, something waiting. She jumped, spinning around to face the room, but the shadows remained silent. They hadn't moved. They were watching her. She could feel them, their eyes on her, but she couldn't see them clearly. Every corner was a threat, every creak in the floor an omen. The whispers grew louder, until they overlapped with the stranger's voice again. His words no longer made sense. They were broken, fragmented, and now they seemed to come from every direction at once, overlapping with the other voices, the whispers, the breathing. Samantha's head pounded, the pressure building inside her skull. Was she losing her mind? Was the stranger even real? The fear in his voice had felt genuine, but now, with the whispers and the growing sense of wrongness, she didn't know what to trust anymore. Nothing was real. Everything was slipping away from her, and the only thing she could hold on to was the terrifying, gnawing certainty that she was being hunted. The phone buzzed again, and this time, when she looked down at the screen, it was a message from an unknown number. The words were simple, chilling. "You're living in a nightmare. It was always meant for you." The door behind her creaked, and Samantha spun, her heart racing. The air felt heavier now, like something was pressing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a man, the stranger. But it wasn't the man she remembered. The face was wrong. It was twisted, disfigured, like something had clawed its way through the skin. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his mouth a jagged mess of teeth, and the skin, sickly pale, stretched tight over bones, looked like it was barely hanging on. Her legs shook, and she took a step back, but the stranger's eyes never left hers. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile that she remembered. It was twisted, a grotesque mockery of the man she once knew. His lips stretched wide, far too wide, and the smile never reached his eyes. It was a predator's grin. "Samantha," he rasped, his voice hollow, like it was being dragged from deep within the earth. "I've come for you." Her heart hammered in her chest as she staggered toward the door, her mind screaming for her to escape, but she couldn't move fast enough. The stranger's face was a nightmare, his features shifting as if they were melting, distorting before her eyes. And then, as she reached for the door, it happened. The door vanished. Just like that. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, leaving only a gaping hole in its place. There was no escape, no way out. She was trapped. The house had swallowed her whole, and the figures, the creatures, they were closing in. They were inside, everywhere. The stranger was inside her mind now, and he was laughing. His distorted, hollow laugh echoed through the empty house, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner. Samantha screamed, but no sound came out. She was trapped, and the nightmare was just beginning. The creatures were closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. She could feel them now, their cold, unnatural presence pressing against her, their twisted bodies moving in and out of the shadows. She was their prey, and they would never let her go. Samantha's mind was unraveling with every step she took. The house, her home, had turned into something else entirely. It was no longer the place she once knew. The walls moved when she wasn't looking, creeping inwards, warping, stretching as though the house itself was alive. She could feel the air shift around her, growing thick and suffocating. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, like it might give way at any moment. Rooms seemed to shift when she wasn't paying attention, leading her into places she didn't recognize, pulling her deeper into the madness. Every corner, every doorway, felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She could hear footsteps echoing behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing. The shadows followed her, always lingering at the edges of her vision, just out of reach, but never far enough to escape. And every time she looked over her shoulder, her reflection in the mirrors had changed. It was no longer just a mirror. It was a twisted, mocking version of herself. At first, it seemed harmless, just a slight shift. Her reflection copying her movements, just like it always did. But as she moved through the house, trying desperately to find an exit, she started to notice something off. The reflection wasn't quite right. It wasn't mimicking her actions exactly. It was distorting them. Her reflection's smile, that cruel, twisted grin, grew wider every time she looked into the glass. The eyes, those eyes that used to be hers, were now darker, hollow, and they glinted with a malice that sent a chill crawling up her spine. She could feel it. Something was watching her, not just from the shadows, but from within that mirror. Her own reflection, now something else, something darker, was moving of its own accord. As she walked past a mirror in the hallway, it didn't just follow her, it smiled at her. A slow, wide grin that didn't belong to her. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She turned, her heart pounding, but when she glanced at the mirror again, it was gone. It had shifted. The reflection had taken her place. Panic surged through her chest. She stumbled backwards, trying to shake the image from her mind, but she couldn't escape it. Every mirror, every reflective surface showed the same thing. Her reflection, moving just a little too slow, just a little too fast. It was always there, always watching, always waiting. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the door, on escape, but it was no use. Every time she approached, the door, once so welcoming, was now blocked. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their surfaces shifting and breathing, as though the house had become something more than just a structure. Something hungry. Samantha's breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed her hands against the door, her eyes frantically scanning the room for a way out. But the house wouldn't let her go. The walls closed in, squeezing her tighter until she could barely move, until the very air seemed to crush her. The reflection, her reflection, was always there, mocking her. It twisted, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it was enjoying her suffering. Each time she turned her back, she could feel it. The glass seemed to breathe with her, its surface rippling like water, as though something inside was waiting for the right moment to emerge. She took a step back from the mirror in the hallway, but the reflection didn't stay behind. It stepped forward. Her hand reached out, trembling, but the reflection reached back. Only it didn't mimic her this time. No, it was reaching for her. The cold fingers of her reflection gripped her wrist, pulling her closer to the glass. Her body jerked in panic, but the reflection had a strength she couldn't match. It pulled harder, and she felt her skin scrape against the cold, smooth surface of the mirror as it sucked her in. Samantha screamed, but her voice was muffled, lost in the glass. The reflection's grip tightened, pulling her forward, as if the mirror itself wanted her to step inside to take her place. She fought back, struggling, but it was no use. The reflection smiled that same, twisted grin, its eyes glowing with cruel satisfaction. It wanted her. It wanted to take her, to trap her inside that mirror, to leave her as nothing more than a shadow, a trapped soul forever watching from the other side. Her heart pounded, panic crashing through her mind like a tidal wave. She had to break free. She had to do something. Anything. Desperation took over. She reached for anything she could find, anything to stop this madness, and her hand closed around a heavy object. She didn't think. She just swung it at the mirror with all her strength. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, and for a moment, she thought she had done it. She thought she had broken free. But when the shards of the mirror fell to the ground, she saw it. Her reflection, standing there, smiling that same horrible, twisted smile, was still there. But now, it wasn't just a reflection. It stepped out of the broken glass, its eyes never leaving her, its grin widening with every passing second. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, but it was too late. The reflection had already crossed the threshold. It was no longer a part of the glass. It was in the room with her, in the space she occupied. And it wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was taking her place. In a panic, Samantha tried to push past the thing, to run, but the reflection, her twisted self, was faster, more powerful, and it reached out, grabbing her by the arm. It pulled her back, and in that moment, she realized with a sickening clarity that it wasn't going to let her go. The reflection's grip tightened, its eyes gleaming with dark triumph. Before she could react, the reflection twisted her wrist, forcing her to the floor, and with one final cold laugh, it stepped fully into the world, leaving Samantha trapped on the other side. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was a prison, and Samantha was the one trapped inside, unable to escape. And now, in her place, her twisted reflection grinned. It was free. It was real. It was her. But it wasn't her. It was something far darker. And as it walked away, the real Samantha could only watch from within the mirror, helpless as her doppelganger roamed the world she could never touch again. Samantha's world had collapsed into silence. The walls of the house seemed to breathe around her, closing in tighter with every passing second. The air was thick and suffocating, charged with an energy so dark it made her skin crawl. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. Her body was frozen, trapped in the mirror, and all she could do was watch as her twisted reflection walked away. Her reflection, but not her. It smiled, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light, and it was taking control of her life, of her body. It was wearing her skin, living her life, while she remained stuck inside the mirror, unable to escape. The house seemed to laugh with her. It wasn't just a structure. It was alive, feeding on her fear, trapping her in this nightmare. Every room she had once known had turned into a maze of shifting walls, distorted shapes, and endless corridors that led nowhere. The creatures, the figures that had once only watched from the shadows, were now inside, moving freely, closing in. She could feel them now, crawling around the house, their presence heavy in the air. She could hear them too, scratching, whispering, their twisted forms slithering the darkness, hunting for something, or someone. They had always been there, lurking, waiting, but now they were everywhere. And she knew it. They were looking for her. Her heart pounded as she strained against the invisible forces holding her in place. The shadow, the dark figure that had always followed her, was drawing nearer. She could feel its presence creeping, inching closer, its cold breath on the back of her neck. It had been with her from the start, a figure of darkness, a silhouette in the corner of her vision. And now she realized it was not just following her. It had always been waiting for her, waiting for this moment. Samantha's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be made. The house was alive, the creatures were hunting, and her reflection was free. There was no escape, no way out. The walls pulsed around her, bending and stretching like the house was breathing, consuming her, taking everything she had left. And then it happened. The shadow stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. Its shape was indistinct, flickering in and out like a shadow cast by a flickering light, but there was no mistaking its presence. It was real. It was here, and it was coming for her. Samantha's pulse quickened as the dark figure drew closer, its cold eyes locking onto hers. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The message was clear. The house was not just a house. It was a prison, a trap, and she had already fallen into it. The truth hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath out of her. She wasn't alive anymore. She hadn't been for some time. She had died, and the house, this house, was where the lost souls were kept. The creatures, the shadows, the figures, they fed on her fear, kept her locked in this never-ending nightmare. The reflection, the thing that had taken her place, was just another piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just mimicking her. It was her. But it was not her. It was what had been left behind. Samantha's thoughts spiraled. Her eyes welled with tears, but she had no voice to cry out with. The creatures, the ones she had thought were just shadows at the edges of her mind, were real. The house was a prison designed to trap souls like hers, to trap them in a never-ending loop of fear and torment. They had been feeding off her for so long, keeping her in this hellish cycle. And now, Even though she couldn't move, couldn't escape, she understood what was happening. She was part of the house now, part of the prison, and it would never let her go. Her reflection, her doppelganger, was now free, living her life. It would never know the horror, the torment, the fear that Samantha had felt, because she was trapped in this mirror, locked in the shadows forever. And then the creatures closed in. They crept through the corners of the room, their twisted, malformed bodies flickering in and out of the dark like phantoms. The walls seemed to pulse around her, closing in tighter with each passing second. The shadows wrapped around her, their whispers clawing at her ears. They were feeding on her fear now. They always had. And she was powerless to stop them. Samantha's mind screamed, but there was no sound. There was only the dark, the shadow, and the endless void of the house. And as the walls closed in, she realized that there was no escape, no way out. She was already dead. And the house would never let her go. Samantha's mind was a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The house around her, the walls that pulsed with dark energy, the creatures that moved in the shadows, it all felt so real. But deep inside, something began to shift, something she couldn't ignore. The whisperer's voice, the figures that had haunted her every step, the stranger who had first appeared. It was all part of something bigger, something twisted. As the house closed in around her, she began to understand the horrifying truth. Everything that had happened, the reflection, the shifting walls, the twisted, distorted realities, had been designed to confuse her, to trap her, to make her believe she could escape, only to watch her fail over and over again. The creatures, the shadows, they were all part of the trap, but none of it was real. It was all an illusion. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't who she thought she was. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't the real Samantha. She wasn't alive. She was a reflection, a ghost, a fragment of a life long gone. Her body, the one she had once called her own, had been dead for years. This house, this nightmare, had been her prison all along. Her mind raced, trying to understand how this could be. How had she not known? How had she been so blind? The house, the creatures, the torment, it was all part of an endless cycle, a loop that had trapped her in the same place over and over again. She had been living in a distorted version of her final moments, reliving the terror, the confusion, the helplessness of her death. Every time she thought she had escaped, every time she tried to break free, the cycle reset, and she had never even known it. The whisperer, the figures, the stranger, they had been leading her here all along. They weren't just part of the house, they were part of her. The reflection in the mirror had been a lie. The house had tricked her into thinking she was still alive, still human. But she wasn't. Not anymore. She had died, and the house had become her tomb, a prison she could never escape. Samantha tried to scream, to cry out, but the words didn't come. There was no voice left inside her. She was trapped in this never-ending nightmare, stuck in a cycle of torment and fear, unable to break free. Her mind screamed in desperation, but the reality she had known was slipping away, fading into darkness. All that was left was the cold, suffocating emptiness of the house. As the creatures closed in, their twisted forms flickering in and out of the shadows, Samantha felt herself slipping further away from the world she had once known. The house seemed to grow darker, more suffocating. The walls pressed in on her, their pulse matching the frantic beat of her heart. And as she felt herself being pulled into the shadows, she realized there was no escape, no way out. The house had claimed her, and it would never let her go.